The coffee was already cold. Was 637? Nolan Gray read at once. Then again, hey, something came up. Can we reschedule? No punctuation, no apology, just a clean exit in 10 words. He didn't flinch, just locked the phone and set it face down on the table, as if that could erase the part of him that thought for half a second that tonight might be different. Across the table, his daughter was lining up sugar packets into tiny forts. Sophie Gray was 6 and sharper than most adults Nolan had worked with. She was also the only reason he'd agreed to show up tonight. She looked up. She's not coming, right? Nolan nodded. Change of plans. Sophie paused, then knocked over the sugar fort with one finger. Maybe that's good. He managed to smile, but it didn't quite land. The cafe around them was warm, quiet, tucked in an old Denver block, just off KFAC's, yellow lights, wooden chairs that creaked. Honestly, books stacked by the window, mostly for show. But in the far corner, something unusual was happening. A small group of kids had gathered near the children's reading nook. Sitting cross-legged on a rug, their eyes were wide, their hands still, and at the center, crouched between a beanbag and a broken lamp, a young woman was telling a story. But the witch didn't vanish. She just changed her name and moved next door, she said, voice alive and steady. The kids erupted into laughter. Sophie turned her head sharply, her attention caught. She's telling it wrong, she whispered. What do you mean? Nolan asked. Sophie slid off her chair. In the real version, the witch gets banished. Hitch added over her shoulder. But maybe hers is better. He let her go, watching her weave between tables like she owned the place. The storyteller was maybe in her early 20s, brown apron, hair tied back in a way that looked more practical than styled. There was something in her voice, not performative, not fake, just steady, like she believed what she was saying. Sophie crouched beside her without hesitation. Nolan stayed seated, pretending to check emails, but really he was just listening. The king, the young woman continued, was very good at remembering names, but very bad at remembering feelings. So, the court hired a girl who could read books upside down and feelings inside out. Her job was to remind him of what he used to care about. Sophie laughed. It was quick, uncontrolled, the kind of laugh that made Nolan look up. He hadn't heard her laugh like that in months. The storyteller smiled down at Sophie, then lowered her voice to a whisper. The two of them leaned in like they were the only two people left in the world, and for a moment Nolan felt it. The same moment you feel when a song you've never heard before sounds like it was written for you. He stood, walked over. The woman looked up, polite, professional. Is she bothering you? Nolan asked. Not at all, she replied. She's correcting my dragon lore. Sophie tugged his sleeve. Dad, this is Ivy. She's writing a story about a knight who can't ride horses. Ivy held out a hand. I'm not sure it's a story yet, just scattered pages. Nolan shook her hand. It was a normal handshake, but something about it didn't feel rehearsed. You're good with kids, he said. Just with the ones who think dragons deserve second chances. Sophie grinned. Dad doesn't like dragons. He says they mess with plot structure. I said that once. Twice, she corrected. Ivy chuckled. Well, he might be right. But sometimes stories need a little mess. Nolan looked at her again. Really looked. Not like a stranger, not like a blind date, just a person. And suddenly, he wasn't thinking about the woman who cannoned or the silence he'd gotten used to carrying. He was thinking about how Sophie had leaned in to listen, how Ivy had paused between. Words to make room for breath, not for attention. That's when Sophie said it. Can we come back tomorrow? Nolan raised an eyebrow. Why? She said. There's a part 2. The knight meets someone new. He glanced at Ivy. She didn't push, didn't hint, just waited like she had all the time in the world. He nodded. All right, part 2. Then, as they stepped outside, Sophie reached up and held his hand, something she rarely did anymore. She didn't say anything else until they reached the car. Then softly she tells stories like Mom used to. Nolan didn't respond, but his fingers tightened just slightly around hers. Behind them, through the cafe window, Ivy returned to clearing. Cups. She didn't know their names. She didn't ask, but she turned just once and watched them go. And without knowing why, she smiled. The next morning, the same cafe smelled of cinnamon and wet sidewalks. Nolan wasn't sure what reason he gave his assistant for clearing his schedule. He just said it involved his daughter, and in truth it did. Sophie held a folded napkin in one hand, on which she'd drawn a stick figure king with a crown slipping off his head. The caption read, "The king who forgot everything."
Oh.
They arrived earlier this time. Ivy was there behind the counter, tying her apron with a soft smile. She noticed Sophie first, then Nolan. Their eyes met, not in surprise, but recognition. The kind of recognition that doesn't demand explanation. Sophie climbed into the reading nook as if it were her stage, waving the napkin like a manuscript. "Can you tell the rest of the story?" she asked. Ivy knelt beside her. "Which part do you want to hear?" "The part where the king starts remembering." Ivy paused, then nodded. She began softly weaving words that made other tables grow quiet. King found an old notebook in the palace attic. Its pages were blank, except for one. Stories are how we remember who we are. He traced the ink with his fingers, and slowly, memory by memory, started to see the world again through the voice of someone who had never stopped telling it for him. But the tale never reached its ending. A sudden rush of new customers interrupted. Orders lined up, machines hissed. Ivy offered an apologetic look and stood up to help. Nolan watched her work, quick, precise, and kind with each person. She didn't fumble or flinch. She made eye contact, remembered names, brought extra napkins before people asked. He realized. It wasn't how she told stories that mattered most. It was how she noticed. Sophie, undistracted, sat down with a crayon and began drawing again. She slid the picture across the table toward Nolan. It was a picture of a girl with long hair holding a book. Next to her was a king, taller, quiet, with one hand resting on his heart. The title scribbled underneath, "The King Who Listens." Nolan didn't comment. He just looked at his daughter, then back at Ivy. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to finish someone else's sentence. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to write the ending to this story himself. That night, when Nolan tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up and asked, "Do you think she'll finish the story tomorrow?" Nolan brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Only one way to find out. Before turning off the light, he picked up his phone and opened his calendar. He typed in one note. "Friday, 8 a.m. coffee, Ivy's shift, don't miss it." The cafe had thinned out, chairs stacked, lights dimmed. Ivy wiped down the last table as the espresso machine let out a final sigh. Sophie was curled in the nook, fast asleep beside her empty cup of cocoa, her sketchbook folded like a diary on her chest. Nolan remained seated by the window, hands wrapped around a half-finished latte. He hadn't planned to stay this long, but for the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about meetings, acquisitions, or forecasts. Just the girl who could make his daughter laugh with mad-up stories, and the silence that felt easy between them. "Sorry, Ivy," said softly, tugging off her apron. "Didn't mean to keep you waiting." "You didn't," Nolan replied. She just wouldn't leave without hearing how the king finds his memories. Ivy smiled as she glanced toward Sophie, who murmured something in her sleep and turned over. "That story still doesn't have an ending." He looked at her. "Do any of them?" She sat across from him without asking. There was no flicker of flirtation, no pretense. Just a tired girl with her hair in a loose braid, and eyes that had learned to carry more than they should. "She reminds me of someone," Ivy said, nodding toward Sophie. "Always watching, like the world's full of clues if you know where to look." Nolan hesitated, then asked, "Did you always want to be a writer?" "My mom was one," she replied. "Not published. Just the kind who filled notebooks no one ever read. She used to say, 'Stories are how we leave breadcrumbs in the dark.'" He was quiet. "Then what happened to her?" Ivy folded her hands. "Car accident, senior year. I took time off school to figure things out and never quite caught up." She didn't say it with pity, just fact. "And you?" She asked, "What made you?" "Become a tech CEO." Nolan let out a breath, more like a laugh with nowhere to land. "I didn't want to be invisible anymore." Ivy looked at him. "I was one of those kids no one picked for teams. One day I built a basic note-sharing app for my class. Teachers used it, then the district. Then I dropped out of college. 10 years later, I had a company, he shrugged. That's the short version. Ivy tilted her head. And the long one. He met her eyes. The long one doesn't fit in a pitch deck. There was a pause, but not uncomfortable. You ever want to write your story? She asked. I tried, he admitted. When I was younger, couldn't get past the first page. Why not? I didn't think anyone would want to read it. Ivy leaned back. Or maybe you were afraid someone would. He looked at her, startled. Her tone wasn't accusing, just honest. I've always wondered, she continued, if people who stopped telling their stories just forgot how to be the hero in them. Something about that made Nolan's throat tighten. He glanced at Sophie, her little chest rising and falling, so unaware of the ghosts that still paced his thoughts. I think I forgot how to. Tell mine altogether, he said quietly. Evie looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folded napkin. She slid it across the table. On it, in blue ink, was a scribbled title. The King Who Waited Too Long. I think that story still has a few blank pages, she said gently. Nolan didn't speak. He didn't need to.
At night.
As he carried Sophie to the car, her head resting on his shoulder, she murmured without opening her eyes. If someone tells the right story about you, don't stop them, Dad. He buckled her in, shut the door, and looked back at the cafe window where Ivy stood, one hand on the glass, watching them leave. For the first time in a very long time, Nolan Gray didn't feel like a man trying to stay hidden. He felt like a character waiting to be written. Right. The cafe printer buzzed softly in the corner, sound barely noticeable over the low jazz humming from the speakers. Ivy was busy clearing the tables while Sophie, unsupervised for just a moment, had found the worked printer behind the counter. She tapped a few keys like she'd seen her dad do, dragged a file from the desktop titled King Without Imagination. Docs, and hit print. By the time Ivy turned around, it was too late. The next morning, Nolan was sitting on the living room couch in sweatpants, his laptop closed beside him. In his hand was the unexpected printout, neatly stapled, marked in Ivy's handwriting, draft, not for eyes. He didn't mean to read it, told himself he wouldn't. But something about Sophie's silence and the note she left on top, written in her uneven 6-year-old scroll, undid him. I want to know how it ends because I think it's about us. The story opened in a small kingdom where memories were banned. The king, wise but hollow-eyed, had locked all books of dreams in the tower and raised his daughter in silence, thinking he was protecting her. But the girl, bold, curious, sneaked into the forbidden library at night, reading stories aloud too. The moon. The more Nolan read, the less he could breathe. It wasn't just fiction, it was a mirror. Ivy had written about a man who feared the past so deeply he outlawed wonder, who mistook protection for love, silence for strength, and in every line Ivy had told the truth. Not his resume, not his net worth, just his ache. Sophie padded into the room with a bowl of cereal. She climbed into his lap without a word, curling against him. He held up the pages. Did you take this from Ivy's computer? She nodded slowly. I just wanted to know what happens to the girl if she helps the king remember. Nolan stared at the manuscript. He didn't know the answer. That afternoon, he returned to the cafe, manuscript in hand, but Ivy wasn't there. A different barista told him she'd quit 2 days ago. Something about class schedules or maybe rent. She didn't say much. Nolan stood there a moment too long. Back in the car, Sophie sat quietly in the back seat, holding the folded draft against her chest, like a map that had failed them. Is she coming back? She asked.
Nolan didn't answer. But that night, after Sophie fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen
table under the low pendant light, flipping through the draft again. At the end, in smaller writing, Ivy had added a final line in pen, paused, because the hero still hasn't chosen to remember what makes him real. Nolan stared at the words for a long time, until the ink blurred behind his eyes. Turned to a blank page and wrote. The king opened the library door and found the girl waiting, holding a story he had once forgotten to tell. He looked up at the dark window, his reflection faint. Sophie's voice echoed in his mind, gentle and clear. If someone tells the right story about you, Don't stop them, Dad. It was still early when Nolan pulled up outside the university campus. The leaves rustled across the asphalt, brittle and restless like paper, waiting for a story. He didn't bring Sophie this time. He didn't know what he was walking into. Inside the student services building, he asked for Ivy Renard, the receptionist. Glanced at a spreadsheet, then hesitated. She filed for academic suspension last week. The woman said something about a financial aid issue. Nolan nodded. Inked her and walked back into the sunlight, carrying more weight than he arrived with. He could have called someone, pulled a few strings, sent a transfer. Instead, he found himself walking 2 blocks to the cafe, now dim and silent. Her apron was gone from the hook behind the counter. The corner where she read 2 children was stacked with chairs. She had vanished from the story like a character who never got to finish her line. That evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a new set of characters for her storybook. She looked up as Nolan entered, holding the manuscript Ivy had written. He stared at the final page again. The handwritten note Ivy left at the bottom hadn't changed. Paused because the main character hasn't yet found the courage to choose joy. He stood there for a long time until Sophie quietly slid something across the table toward him. A folded paper written in purple crayon. It was a contract at the top in block letters, story agreement underneath. Miss Ivy tells half the story. Daddy must tell the rest. Signed, Sophie Gray. Nolan laughed once, the sound barely audible, then knelt beside her chair. He thinks stories work like that. Sophie looked at him serious, said you were scared to be told wrong. Maybe if both of you write it, it won't be wrong. He held the paper for a moment longer, then picked up a pen. Okay, he whispered. Let's find out what the next chapter looks like. He didn't know yet where to start. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready to begin. And somewhere across the city, in a rented room lit by one flickering lamp, Ivy stared at her laptop screen. Her tuition invoice sat unopened beside her. She didn't touch it. Instead, she opened a blank document and typed 4 words. Chapter 10. He stayed. She didn't know if she'd send it or if he'd read it, but the silence between them no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a waiting page. The trouble started 3 days after Ivy disappeared from campus. It began with a blurry photo of the 2 of them at the cafe weeks earlier. Sophie sitting at a table nearby. Mid-laugh. Someone captioned it. From coffee girl to CEO's mistress. Billionaire's new flame stirs scholarship scandal. By noon, it had gone viral. Ivy didn't see the post at first. She was too busy boxing up the last of her things from the shared apartment she could no longer afford. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Classmates, co-workers, even her former roommate. Some curious, some cruel. No one offered help. When she finally read the headline, she just stared. Not at the gossip, not at the photo, but at her own name, now tagged in every comment. Night, a letter slid under her door. The university's financial aid office had placed her scholarship under review, citing concerns over public image and ethical representation. She hadn't asked Nolan for help, and now they said she was sleeping her way into opportunity. Across the city, Nolan sat in his study, facing an email chain forwarded by his legal team. Sophie padded into the room barefoot, holding the crumpled contract she'd once drawn in purple crayon. She laid it gently on the desk. I added something, she whispered. He unfolded it beneath the original line. If Miss Ivy tells half the story, Daddy must tell the rest. Sophie had written, and people who tell stories kindly should be allowed to finish them. 8. Nolan looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Then he nodded, stood up, and opened the drawer where Ivy's manuscript still rested. He didn't call his lawyers. He didn't issue a press release. Instead, the next morning, a sealed envelope arrived at the university president's office. Inside was a manuscript, Ivy's. On the cover, a simple note, "This is what she's being punished for." He included no name, no title, just the story, and the hope that somewhere in the noise, the truth could still be heard. By sunset, Ivy received an unexpected email from the scholarship board. They were requesting a meeting not for discipline, for reconsideration. The boardroom was silent, save for the shuffle of paper and the hum of the old ceiling fan. Nolan sat across from the scholarship committee, 5 members, all older than him, all watching him with polite suspicion. He hadn't worn a suit, no tie, just a weathered jacket and the same calm expression he wore when walking Sophie to school. He didn't say his name, didn't mention his net worth. He simply slid a folder across the table. One of the members, a woman, with gray streaks in her braid, opened it. Inside was Ivy's manuscript. The memory girl printed on soft ivory paper. No title page, no credentials, only a handwritten note clipped to the top. She doesn't need your permission to write, just the space to keep going. Nolan waited as they skimmed. First, they read out of obligation. Then, one by one, their eyes stopped scanning. Their fingers slowed. I don't understand, said a man in corduroy. Why are you showing us this? Nolan leaned forward. Yes. You judged her character through a headline. But her character lives in these pages. Silence. He looked at each of them. Calm, controlled, but his voice caught just for a breath. If writing like that isn't worthy of finishing school, then this system isn't broken. It's afraid. The older woman looked at the last page. There in Ivy's own handwriting was a sentence. Sometimes you don't write to be read. You write to remember who you were before the world told you to forget. She folded the folder shut, then said nothing. Nolan nodded once, stood, and left. He never told Ivy about the meeting. He simply returned home, walked into the quiet apartment, and helped Sophie set the table for 3. Later that night, as Ivy curled under a blanket on her friend's couch, her phone vibrated once. It's just a line from the university's registrar, Miss Lane. We'd like to invite you back. The campus looked different when you'd lost something in it, and then came back to find it still waiting. Ivy stepped onto the quad like it was the first day again. But her hands didn't tremble this time. The buildings were the same, the bricks. Still cold, but something had shifted, not the place. Her. As she crossed the library steps, a small voice called out, Miss Ivy. She turned. Sophie stood at the edge of the lawn, holding a gift bag, 2 hands wide. Her backpack bounced with each step as she ran to catch up. For you, Sophie said. It's not much, but it's for the story. Inside the bag was a white, leather-bound notebook, its pages crisp, untouched, and a fountain pen with her initials etched into the cap. Ivy blinked, then whispered, Sophie, why this? The little girl tilted her head, because the last story. You wrote made Daddy cry, and because, if you write more, I want to be in it. Ivy knelt slowly, eyes stinging. You already are, Sophie fidgeted, then added. I picked the color because white's what people use to start over, and you're not done yet. Behind her, Nolan watched from a distance. Didn't approach, didn't interrupt, just stayed by the gate. Arms crossed loosely as if giving her space was his only way of being close. Ivy rose. She looked down at the notebook again. For months, her pages had been full of apologies, scratched out paragraphs, questions no one answered. This one was empty. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because maybe for the first time, she wasn't writing to escape anymore. She was writing to return. A return not to the past, but to herself. She smiled and walked back toward the library. The new notebook held firmly against her chest. The cafe was quieter now. The winter crowd had thinned and soft acoustic music played low in the background. Outside, flakes began to fall, light at first, then thicker, dusting the sidewalk with memory. Ivy sat at the far end of the room near the window, her new notebook open, the first page still blank. She hadn't written a word yet, not because she didn't know what to say, but because for the first time in years, she wasn't writing to survive. She was writing to begin. A shadow passed over her table. She looked up. Nolan set down a cup of cocoa and a familiar leather folder. The worn copy of her manuscript still creased at the corners. He didn't sit immediately, just stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle between them. I figured, he said quietly, if you were going to write a new chapter, maybe we could be in the first sentence. Ivy blinked, her hand instinctively. Close the notebook. No promises, she said. But her voice was softer than before. I'm not asking for any, Nolan replied. only a seat at the table. He turned to leave, but before he could step away, she reached into her bag and pulled out the fountain pen Sophie had gifted her. She held it out to him. "Write it with me," she said, "because no one should have to tell their story alone." Hesitated just for a second, then took the pen. He sat down. Moments later, a third voice called from across the cafe. Was there room for one more? Sophie ran in, cheeks pink from the cold, dragging a tiny sketchbook in one hand and a paper crown in the other. He laughed and slid over it always. They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. Outside the window, the snow fell heavier, now layering the city in silence, just like it had the first day they met. But this time, the story wasn't unfinished. It was just beginning again. It was never meant to be a bestseller. Ivy reminded herself of that as she smoothed the creases. On her dress, her fingers trembling slightly. She stood backstage behind a thin curtain of velvet and nerves waiting for her cue. A year had passed, not fast, not slow, just honest. She hadn't planned to publish The Memory Girl. At first, it was just a way to give Sophie something permanent. A fairy tale where the brave didn't wear armor and the monsters weren't evil, just misunderstood. But somehow, those pages had found their way into classrooms, into hands that needed healing, into the quiet corners of hearts like hers once was. A voice called out through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the author of the essay, Memory Girl, Ivy Lane." She stepped forward into the light. The hall was modest, a public library auditorium, folding chairs, paper cups of juice and coffee, half the crowd made up of children and tired parents. But Ivy had never stood in front of a room full of faces who came for her. Not until now. Front row, Sophie sat cross-legged on her chair, wearing the same paper crown from that first day. She looked up and winked. Beside her sat Nolan, not in a suit, not as a CEO, just as a father, just as a man who had once forgotten how to believe in unfinished stories. Ivy adjusted the mic. "I used to think memory was just something you carry, but I've learned memory is something you choose to carry or choose to rewrite." She nodded towards Sophie. "This book exists because someone very small reminded me that not all endings are permanent, and sometimes what we call the end is just the last page of the wrong draft." There was quiet, the kind that doesn't beg for applause, but allows room for something gentler. Then Sophie stood. Without waiting for permission, she opened the final page of the book and read aloud. "People say memories are meant to keep, but sometimes the most important memories are the ones we choose to change. This time we told it right." A hush fell over the room, then clapping, tentative at first, then steady, then filling the space with warmth. Ivy looked into the crowd. Near the back of the room, Nolan had stepped away. He wasn't beside Sophie anymore, stood behind the rows, quiet, hands folded, not claiming space, not owning the moment, just witnessing it. She met his eyes. Nodded once. She didn't cry. She smiled. One of those rare, anchored smiles you give someone who has seen you break and stayed anyway. Later, after the books were signed, and the kids asked who the rabbit was based on, and Sophie had fallen asleep, on a beanbag, Ivy found Nolan by the window looking out at the street. The snow was falling again, same as that day. "I didn't expect this," she said quietly. Nolan turned. "Neither did I." "You came," she said. "I always will," he replied, "even when I stand in the back." She held out a copy of The Memory Girl signed, but not with ink. Inside, on the dedication page, she'd written, "For the man who didn't save me, but stood beside me until I could save myself. And for the girl who reminded us both how to begin again." Nolan looked down at the page, then back at her. "Still no happy ending?" he asked. "No," Ivy said, stepping closer. "Just a better beginning." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. They walked out together into the falling snow, past the library, past the streetlights, past the version of themselves who had once been strangers, and into a chapter no one had written yet. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Every day we bring you more heartfelt stories that inspire, heal, and remind us that love can begin in the most unexpected places. See you in the next story.